I sat in the quiet courtroom, holding my newborn daughter tight, as the judge delivered the final verdict that stripped my father, Harrison, of every asset he owned and sent him to face legal justice. He glared at me across the aisle, realizing the daughter he discarded in her darkest hour had dismantled his entire life without saying a single word. But to understand how a father could lose everything to his own child, you have to go back to the night he left me out in the cold. My name is Skylar, and at 26 years old, I used to believe that family was an unbreakable contract. I thought blood meant something, that no matter how dark the world got outside your front door, the people who brought you into this life would always hold a safety net beneath you. I was naive. I learned the hard way that for some people, family is nothing more than a transaction, and loyalty only lasts as long as you are convenient to them. I grew up right here in Spokane, Washington. If you've ever spent a winter in Spokane, you know how brutal it gets. The wind cuts right through your jacket, and the snow piles up against the porches until everything looks frozen and dead. But for a long time, my home felt warm, mostly because of my mother, Raven. Raven was the quiet heart of our family. She was gentle, patient, and spent her whole life keeping the peace between my father, Harrison, and the rest of the world. Harrison was a different kind of man altogether. He was rigid, obsessed with financial status, and viewed every relationship through the lens of control. To Harrison, image was everything. He worked hard to maintain the appearance of a successful, respectable man in Spokane, but behind closed doors, his affection was conditional. You only earned his approval if you followed his exact blueprint for your life. And I broke that blueprint the day I chose to marry Liam. Liam wasn't wealthy. He didn't come from a prominent family, and he didn't hold a corporate title that Harrison could brag about at dinner parties. Liam was a carpenter, hardworking, honest, and fiercely protective of me. When I told my father that Liam and I were getting married, Harrison made his stance crystal clear. He told me I was making a catastrophic mistake, throwing away my future for someone beneath our social standing. But my mother stood by me. Raven saw how deeply Liam loved me, and with her quiet encouragement, Liam and I built a modest life together. We rented a small, cozy apartment on the outskirts of Spokane. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. For 3 years, we scraped by, saving every dollar we could to build a real future. When I found out I was pregnant, it felt like the final piece of our puzzle had fallen into place. Liam worked overtime every single week, coming home with sawdust in his hair and a massive smile on his face, rubbing my growing stomach and talking to our unborn baby girl. We were so happy. Then, in a single afternoon, my entire world turned to ash. It was a rainy Tuesday when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was cold, clinical, and completely detached from the horror of the words it was delivering. Liam had been in a fatal highway accident on his way back from a job site. Just like that, the man who held my world together was gone. I was 26, 6 months pregnant, drowning in grief, and unable to pay the rent on our apartment with the tiny savings we had left. Desperate, broken, and carrying a child I had no idea how to protect on my own, I had no choice but to pack up my life and look toward the one place I thought was left for me, my childhood home. Walking back through the front door of my childhood home in Spokane felt less like a homecoming and more like surrendering the last piece of my independence. But carrying Liam's child gave me a sense of purpose I couldn't afford to abandon. I had to survive, not just for myself, but for the tiny life growing inside me. My mother, Raven, met me at the door with open arms. The moment her arms wrapped around my shoulders, I collapsed into tears. She held me right there in the entryway, whispering that everything was going to be fine, that her home was my home, and that we would figure out how to raise this baby together. Raven didn't care about social status or pride. She only cared about her child and her future grandchild. She cleared out my old bedroom, helped me carry in the few boxes I managed to save from our apartment, and made sure I felt safe. My father, Harrison, was an entirely different story. The day I moved back in, Harrison barely looked at me. He stood in the living room with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes cold and calculating. There was no warm embrace, no words of sympathy for the sudden loss of my husband, and no congratulations for the grandchild I was carrying. Instead, he treated my presence like an inconvenient debt that had finally come due. He reminded me, within hours of my arrival, that he had warned me about marrying Liam. He told me that my situation was the direct result of my own poor choices, and that living under his roof meant I had to abide strictly by his rules. He made it clear that every meal I ate and every room I occupied was an act of charity on his part, a charity he felt I hadn't earned. Despite Harrison's coldness, I found solace in taking care of my mother. Shortly after I moved back, Raven's health began to decline rapidly. What started as mild fatigue quickly turned into a severe, debilitating illness that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. While dealing with the emotional weight of missing Liam and managing the physical strain of my own advancing pregnancy, I took on the role of Raven's full-time caregiver. Day in and day out, I was by her side. I cooked her meals, managed her medication schedules, helped her sit up, and kept her comfortable. Harrison rarely stepped into her room. He spent his evenings locked away in his home office or out in the city, managing his investments and attending business dinners, completely detached from the quiet suffering happening inside his own house. Whenever he did walk into the room, it wasn't to offer support, it was to complain about the medical expenses or the gloomy atmosphere of the house. Raven knew her time was short. During those quiet late-night hours, while I sat beside her bed holding her hand, she would look at me with tears in her eyes and apologize for not being able to protect me from Harrison's harshness. She kept reassuring me that she had taken steps to ensure I wouldn't be left with nothing. I didn't care about money back then. I just wanted my mother to live. I wanted her to meet my baby. By the time I reached my 8th month of pregnancy, the house was silent. My mother passed away peacefully on a cold Sunday morning, holding my hand until her final breath. Her loss shattered me completely. Standing at her funeral, heavy with child and consumed by grief, I realized I was truly alone in that house with Harrison. The one person who had stood as a buffer between my father's cold authority and my vulnerable reality was gone. I had no idea that within just days of burying my mother, Harrison's absolute lack of empathy would take an even darker turn. The soil over my mother's grave was barely settled when the atmosphere in our Spokane home shifted from solemn grief to something far more sinister. Less than 2 weeks after Raven's funeral, Harrison walked into the dining room during breakfast and nonchalantly announced that he wouldn't be dining alone that evening. He didn't offer any context or explanation. He simply told me to clear my mother's personal belongings out of the master suite before 7 o'clock. That evening, the front door opened, and Harrison stepped inside with a woman named Tiffany. Tiffany was 24 years old, 2 years younger than me. She wore heavy designer clothing, carried expensive leather handbags, and had a sharp, predatory smile that made my stomach turn. Harrison introduced her as his new wife. He had secretly married her in a quick courthouse ceremony, sweeping aside 30 years of marriage to my mother as if Raven had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. From the second Tiffany crossed the threshold, she viewed me as a threat. To her, an 8-month pregnant, grieving daughter living in the house was a financial liability and an obstacle to her total control over Harrison's wealth. She didn't try to hide her contempt. She immediately began asserting her dominance over the household, rearranging the furniture my mother had selected, throwing away Raven's lingering possessions, and treating me like an unwanted squatter in my own childhood home. Every single day became an exercise in psychological warfare. Tiffany would intentionally leave tasks undone and claim to Harrison that I was refusing to contribute. She would make snide comments about my late husband Liam, questioning his ability to provide and mocking the fact that I was forced to rely on her new husband's hospitality. Harrison didn't just allow this behavior, he actively encouraged it. Tiffany had completely hypnotized him, feeding his ego and convincing him that he was a powerful, wealthy patriarch who was being taken advantage of by an ungrateful daughter. The tension escalated rapidly over the course of a single week. I spent most of my time confined to my small bedroom, trying to protect my unborn baby from the constant stress. I was 8 months pregnant, physically exhausted, and emotionally drained, counting down the days until my delivery so I could figure out a way to leave. But Tiffany didn't want to wait for me to leave on my own terms. She wanted me gone immediately. It all culminated on a freezing Thursday night in late November. The temperature in Spokane had plummeted well below freezing, and a bitter snowstorm was blowing through the streets. I had walked down to the kitchen to get a glass of water when I overheard Tiffany talking to Harrison in his office. "She's a leech, Harrison," Tiffany was whispering, her voice dripping with venom. "She's going to birth that kid and stay in this house forever. She's going to drain your savings, claim a piece of this estate, and ruin everything we're trying to build. You need to make a choice right now. It's either her or me." Instead of defending his own flesh and blood, Harrison didn't hesitate for a second. "You're right," he said coldly. "I've carried her long enough." A moment later, Harrison stepped out of the office, his face twisted in anger. He marched into the kitchen, grabbed my forearm with a tight, suffocating grip, and began dragging me toward the front foyer. I was trembling, holding my hands over my stomach to protect my baby, pleading with him to listen to me, to remember my mother, to look at the freezing weather outside. "You don't belong in this house anymore, Skylar," Harrison sneered, his voice completely void of any fatherly warmth. "You made your choice years ago, when you married that useless carpenter. I'm done paying for your mistakes." Tiffany stood in the hallway behind him, her arms crossed, a cruel smirk playing on her lips as she watched him haul me toward the main entrance. I tried to anchor my feet against the hard flooring, begging him to at least let me grab my coat and my shoes, but he didn't care. He hauled me to the heavy wooden front door, yanked it open, and threw me out onto the icy porch. The force of the impact sent me tumbling onto the frozen concrete steps. Pain shot through my spine as I landed heavily on my side. Before I could even attempt to push myself up, Harrison slammed the thick front door shut. A second later, the heavy deadbolt clicked into place. I sat there in the dark, shivering violently in the howling winter wind, clutching my abdomen as a sharp, agonizing contraction rippled through my body. Right there on the frozen porch, while my father locked the door from the inside, my water broke. The bitter Spokane wind howled across the porch, cutting straight through my clothes as I lay huddled on the frozen concrete. Panic surged through my entire body. I could feel the ice soaking through my clothing, but inside, an intense wave of heat and shock took over. My water had broken, and 8 months into my pregnancy, in the dead of winter, my baby girl was coming right now. I raised my hand and banged on the heavy wooden door with everything I had left. "Dad, please," I sobbed, my voice cracking against the wind. "My water broke. Please open the door. Help me." Through the glass pane beside the frame, I saw the dim lights of the foyer. I saw Harrison's shadow stand near the door for a fraction of a second, before Tiffany's silhouette stepped up beside him, grabbed his arm, and pulled him back into the living room. Then, the foyer light went completely dark. They turned their backs on me, stepped deeper into the warmth of the house, and left me outside to suffer in the freezing snow. In that exact second, as I clutched my stomach on those frozen steps, something inside me snapped. The deep grief I had carried for Liam, the suffocating sadness over losing my mother, and the quiet fear I had held toward my father completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The naive daughter who kept waiting for her father's approval died on that porch. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a mother, and I was going to ensure that Harrison and Tiffany paid for every single drop of cruelty they had inflicted on us. Skylar. Oh my God, Skylar. A panicked voice broke through the freezing dark. Light flooded across the snow-covered lawn as the porch door of the neighboring house flew open. It was Stephen and Brenda, our longtime neighbors who had lived next door since I was a child. Brenda had heard my muffled screaming through her open window and rushed outside, wrapped in a heavy coat, with Stephen right behind her. "Stephen, call 911 right now," Brenda screamed, dropping to her knees on the icy steps beside me. She immediately pulled off her thick winter coat and wrapped it tightly around my shivering shoulders. "Hold on, honey. We've got you. You're safe now." Stephen sprinted back inside his house, frantically dialing emergency services. Within minutes, the distant sound of sirens pierced through the winter night, growing louder until bright red and blue emergency lights illuminated the snow-covered street. An ambulance and 2 Spokane police cruisers pulled up directly in front of the driveway. Paramedics rushed up the walkway with a gurney, wrapping me in thermal blankets and carefully lifting me off the concrete. As they pushed me toward the heated back of the ambulance, I saw 2 police officers march up Harrison's front steps and knock heavily on the front door, demanding an immediate answer. Through the rear windows of the ambulance, as the doors were closing, I caught a glimpse of the front curtains twitching. Harrison and Tiffany were peering out, their faces pale with terror, as they realized the police were on their doorstep. Panic took over them. Instead of opening the door, they slipped through the darkness toward the back exit, fleeing into the night in their car to evade immediate questioning. The paramedics moved quickly, keeping me stable, as the ambulance sped through the snowy streets of Spokane toward the emergency room. Hours later, in a warm, sterile hospital room surrounded by nurses and doctors, I gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl. Holding her tiny, miraculous body in my arms, I looked down at her soft face and made her a silent promise. Those who tried to destroy us were about to lose everything. Sitting in that hospital bed with my newborn daughter wrapped in a warm blanket, I met with the Spokane police detectives. My voice didn't tremble. I laid out every single detail of what had transpired. The emotional abuse, Harrison forcing me out into sub-zero temperatures while 8 months pregnant, and how he locked the door while I screamed for medical help. I filed a formal criminal complaint for felony reckless endangerment and domestic abandonment, while the police issued warrants for Harrison and Tiffany, who had fled to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town in a desperate attempt to evade arrest. I took the next decisive step. I called my mother Raven's estate attorney. For years, Harrison had made everyone believe that he was the sole financial engine of the family, that the large house in Spokane and all our family assets belonged entirely to him. But my mother was far smarter than Harrison ever gave her credit for. During those quiet, late-night conversations in her sickbed, she had dropped hints about protecting my future. When her attorney arrived at the hospital with her finalized estate portfolio, the truth finally came to light. The deed to the Spokane home had originally been purchased using my mother's family inheritance. Decades ago, she had quietly set up the property deed and primary liquidity accounts under a joint survivorship trust. Harrison had managed the day-to-day accounts, but under the explicit terms of the trust, upon Raven's death, 50% of the entire estate's capital and property equity transferred immediately to me, not to Harrison. Furthermore, the trust contained a strict conduct clause drafted by my mother. If any surviving beneficiary attempted to unlawfully deprive or harm another named heir, or committed a criminal act against them on the property grounds, their legal right to manage the trust was instantly revoked, handing full administrative power over to the victim. Harrison didn't just break moral laws when he threw his pregnant daughter into the snow. He triggered a trap my mother had set to ensure he could never ruin my life. With the legal evidence assembled, my attorney moved with surgical precision. We filed for an emergency freeze on all joint bank accounts associated with the estate, blocking Harrison's access to every dollar he thought was his. We then served an immediate order of protection and an emergency eviction notice for the Spokane home. 3 days later, Harrison and Tiffany were picked up by state troopers at a gas station after their credit cards were repeatedly declined. They were brought back to Spokane in handcuffs. When Harrison appeared in court for his arraignment, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his tailored suits, he looked utterly broken. He expected to post bail using his home equity or liquid savings, but as he stood before the judge, my attorney presented the certified trust documents and the frozen account statements. The judge looked at the police reports, reviewed the medical records from the night my water broke in the freezing snow, and denied his motion to use trust funds for his legal defense. Sitting in the courtroom with my baby in my arms, I watched Harrison's face drain of color as the reality hit him. The daughter he treated as a penniless burden now controlled the deed to his house, the access to his accounts, and the legal narrative of his life. Within 2 weeks of his incarceration while awaiting trial, Tiffany showed her true colors. Realizing that Harrison was facing real prison time, that the money was completely gone, and that he no longer owned the Spokane estate, she didn't waste a single moment. She hired a public defender, filed for an immediate annulment and legal divorce from behind bars, and cleaned out the tiny personal allowance Harrison had left in a separate account before disappearing from Spokane entirely. 2 months after that freezing November night, I stood on the front porch of the Spokane house, holding my daughter Clara, wrapped safely in a soft wool blanket. The deadbolt that Harrison had locked against me was now opened by my own keys. The court had finalized the transfer of the entire estate into my name, stripping Harrison of his legal rights to the property and forcing full financial restitution for the medical and legal costs he had caused. Harrison was convicted of felony reckless endangerment and domestic abuse. He was sentenced to 2 years in a state facility. In the end, he lost everything he had spent his life obsessing over. His wealth was gone, his reputational status in Spokane was obliterated. The young wife who had manipulated him abandoned him the second the money dried up, and the house he tried to kick me out of now belonged entirely to the daughter he discarded. He is sitting in a cold cell, with no family, no assets, and no legacy left to his name. Returning to this home wasn't easy at first, but I knew I had to reclaim it for my mother, for Liam, and for Clara. I cleared out every trace of Harrison and Tiffany's short presence, redecorating the rooms with bright colors, warm wooden furniture, and framed photographs of Liam and my mother, Raven. I wanted Clara to grow up knowing she was born from love, strength, and resilience, surrounded by the memory of those who truly cared for us. To secure our financial future on my own terms, I decided to do something I had never done before. I bought a camera, set it up on a small tripod in our living room, and shared our story. I filmed a raw, unfiltered video describing everything I had endured. From losing Liam, to caring for my mother, to surviving that bitter snowstorm on the porch, and ultimately taking my life back through justice. I uploaded that first video to YouTube, not knowing if anyone would listen. But within days, the story exploded. Millions of people from around the world watched it, leaving hundreds of thousands of comments offering support, love, and solidarity. Viewers resonated deeply with my story of overcoming family betrayal and standing up against cruelty. What started as a single confession video quickly transformed into a thriving online channel. Today, I work from home as a full-time creator, earning an independent, comfortable income that allows me to give Clara every opportunity in the world. I don't have to rely on anyone else's charity or approval ever again. Every evening, as I sit by the warm fireplace in our Spokane home with Clara resting peacefully in my arms, I look out the window at the falling snow. I am no longer that frightened, pregnant girl begging for help outside a locked door. I survived the cold, I protected my child, and I built a life of total freedom and peace out of the ashes of their betrayal.